Hello everyone, and welcome to another Ask a Geographer session with me, Professor John Anderson from the School of Geography and Planning, Cardiff University. And in this session, I'm going to answer some questions from sixth form students about regeneration, and I'll do my best. Okay, so the first question, how is rebranding different from regeneration? So as we know, places around us change all the time. They change due to global processes or local processes, processing happening at a range of geographical scales. They can change due to policy, due to environmental change, to cultural and social change. And all these things have implications for the communities that live there, for the different built environment that people live in, to the different social groups that live in an area. And issues of rebranding and regeneration seek interventions in those broader processes to try to improve the situation. Regeneration might come from a particular policy intervention or investment in a local area that seeks to change the built form, for example. It might seek to redevelop brownfield sites. It might change the use of a particular location, introduce new facilities, build new houses, put in new parks, change the material fabric of an environment with economic consequences, with social consequences, and indeed with environmental consequences, because in a really straightforward level, there's more trees or fewer trees, there's more transport or less transport, there's better sewage systems. It might change the area materially. And I think regeneration is usefully thought about those types of interventions. Rebranding, on the other hand, might not actually change the things that are there, but it might try to sell them in a different way. It might try to market them in a particular way. This might be from an area of dockland, for example, that was once in industrial use, but people are trying to encourage it for more leisure facilities, for example, and simply through marketing campaigns, by brochures, by social media campaigns, etc., you might try to change people's attitude towards those places. Stop thinking of it as a place for this and start thinking of it as a place for this. So the types of places which might need to be rebranded and so its message, its identity changed and marketed in a different way might be those that aren't necessarily being as successful as they once were, and they need a kind of shot in the arm. They need a fillip. They need to improve their situation. And instead of changing the built form or the material artifacts and facilities that are there, they might simply try to change the way people think about them. And there's a couple of examples that I've put on the page there about Wales as a nation trying to rebrand itself not as a place of coal industry or steel industry or iron industry, not primary industry, but rather changing its branding, its identity in the minds of potential tourists, perhaps, in terms of a place of adventure, a place of myth and legend, a sense of place being created that is exciting, that is different, that perhaps is non-urban. So if you put in Epic Wales into a Google search, or click on the YouTube links through this PowerPoint, see what you think about the ways in which Wales as a nation has been branded or indeed rebranded. What types of activity are being encouraged? What types of people are being encouraged to Wales? Where might those places, where might those people be coming from? And what sort of industries might they support? As a consequence of that, you could ask yourself questions about how welcome do you think this type of branding is by the people who live in those places? What sort of places are being created or are sought to be created through this type of branding? And how welcome do you think that might be? You might, for example, think it's welcome in terms of it's going to encourage tourism, and therefore it's going to encourage money and visitors to the area. And therefore that's a good thing because it's going to create local jobs and stabilise the local economy and allow things to develop. But to what extent might that economy be seasonal in nature? To what extent it might encourage second homeowners? To what extent might it create or create a sense that Wales is a playground and not a place of other types of industry? And how might that, to some extent, undermine a sense of identity and a sense of pride in a particular location? So none of these answers are relatively are straightforward or easy to come up with. But both regeneration, changing the built form, and rebranding, changing the way we think about these places, has huge effects on what a place can be. And for more of that, and more on that, you can look at some other podcasts that I've put together in relation to place and culture. What's the most successful regeneration activity or project that you know? Well, that is a tough old question, because as we've just seen from the previous example, regeneration can be judged on many different criteria. It could be judged on economic criteria, social criteria, or environmental criteria. It could be judged on all those criteria in relation to the types of community that it affects. Might that be the local community? Might that be a community at another scale? So it might be the national community, for example. It might be something at the regional scale. It might even be at the global scale. So something might have not so great effects at the local level, but on the global level be really good. So how do you judge success? And often what we do as geographers is outline all these different criteria that we could judge a regeneration project on, and look at how it does on each of those different criteria, and then take a final judgment, take into account all those different criteria. Okay? And I think most people will come up with a different sense of whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, as a consequence of looking at all those things on balance. These things inherently, therefore, are political decisions. So you might think a particular regeneration project in your area has been great because it's provided young people, for example, with, I don't know, a skate park, for example. But then if you're an elderly person, you used to walk your dog in that area, you can go, well, I appreciate that young people need somewhere to go, but that was my place. I walked the dog. I've been walking there for 50 years. I feel as if my sense of place and my sense of belonging in that location has now gone. How do we judge whether that was good or bad, more successful or less successful? It comes down, well, I think that comes down to how you think different value judgments should be made in society. If you want to look at a good example of this, I've done a little lecture pod about a brownfield regeneration site in Cardiff called the Tram Shed, and it's in a particular neighbourhood in Cardiff called Grangetown. And if you want to know a little bit about that and judge for yourself whether it's successful or not, you can look in that pod. What is stew gentrification? Can you give example of a place that has been stew gentrified? What a great phrase. It's a phrase that is relatively new, and it's based on a phrase and a process that I'm sure you're quite aware of, this process of gentrification, this process of a particular area through regeneration processes, perhaps encouraging more middle class people, more affluent people into an area, and therefore lifting an area economically, but having particular consequences for the local generation that might not be so affluent, and then not being able to afford housing, being pushed out. And if they're being pushed out from the housing stock, where do they go? What happens to them? So an economically led regeneration process might become a form of gentrification with potentially negative social consequences. Okay, now this process of gentrification might happen in particular areas of a city where students live, and this is where the process of stew gentrification comes in. I've done a podcast to talk about this in general. The idea is that students may be becoming more middle class. They may be, particularly in Russell Group universities, universities where you need high grades to get in, you know, the A's and the B's of this world, the research-led institutions. They encourage students to attend that either have family money or have access to credit. okay? And they want to live a life not of the traditional students slumming about in greasy spoon cafes and going to late night clubs and all that sort of stuff, but to live the life that they want to aspire to after they've been students. They want to live in really nice houses with, great kitchens and showers and all this sort of stuff, high-end studio flats, and go to nice cafes and have their mochaccino latte cafe culture as part of their student lives. As a consequence of that, areas that were once studentified in nature are themselves becoming middle class, with a whole range of facilities, bistros, delis, high-end cafes, maybe even high-end gyms in those locations that were once thought to be beyond the economic ability to pay of students, but now students are willing to buy those higher-end facilities. And we see this new process, not simply of gentrification or studentification, but stu-gentrification. And an example of that is in Cathays in Cardiff, and I've done a little film about that if you want to know more. So what facilities would you get in a studentified area? Well, we just covered that, I think. Okay, there's a question. Rural urban spatial inequality in Wales. Is it bad, and why? Okay, bad is a tricky question to answer. If you mean, and as you go into university, you kind of get a little bit more precise with your words, perhaps. So is it significant? Is it severe? Is it a marked trend? And rural urban inequality in Wales is a marked trend on a whole range of criteria, from the economic to the social to the environmental to the socio-demographics, the type of people who live there, to the type of industries, the type of culture even that are there, the type of mobility in terms of social mobility, how well you can kind of move through the different classes, if you like, but also simply getting around. How easy is it to get around? If you think about urban areas, they have rail systems and public transport systems, far less frequent and far less available, and perhaps even far less affordable in rural areas. So it pushes people into use of a private car with particular environmental consequences, but also particularly leaves people who without an access to the car with lower levels of mobility. So on a whole range of criteria, there is an inequality between rural areas in Wales and urban areas in Wales. And more than that, you can even think about Wales as in having different types of rurality. In South Wales, for example, the rurality you might get in the Vale of Glamorgan or in Monmouthshire, within easy distance of the Cardiff city region, within 20 minutes drive, for example, you're still on really good rail networks. You can still get in and out of the city really well. That's a different type of rurality than perhaps in Mid Wales and in Ceredigion in Powys, for example, where you might be what's known as in the green desert, which is, beautiful landscape, but few industries, perhaps based on kind of highland agriculture. But only in the small market towns might you have anything in relation to a booming local economy. So that presents particular problems for issues of regeneration and indeed place rebranding, which we've mentioned on the other pod. So are rural areas or urban areas in more need of regeneration? How can strategies to regenerate them vary? Or well, they can vary in a whole manner of ways depending on what your goal is. You think about that regeneration again in terms of the economic, the social and the environmental. What do you, as a decision maker, want to do? Do you want to improve social inequality? Do you want to just generate income and let the market take its course? Do you want to just clean up particular areas that have once perhaps been polluted by heavy industry? What's particularly your goals, and what negative effects does by doing one have on the other? Could you get a strategy that could be good for all three? If you could, which particular communities does it benefit? The local community, the regional community, the national community, the global community. Which ones are your constituencies, and which ones do you want to have success for? These are the different criteria where it leads to different types of regeneration strategy that you could study. Can we solve regional inequality? And does anyone actually benefit from inequality? Oh, what a brilliant question. A little bit of me would like to think that inequality is unjust, that humans all have equal value, and both as citizens, as decision makers, as academics, we want to tackle and solve inequality, be it within regions or between regions. But if you think, let's say issues of poverty, you might put in this question, could you solve poverty? But poverty becomes something, as an example, that always changes. I don't know if we've ever been in human society in a place where there's been more affluence than we are in the 21st century, that we have more people doing well in the 21st century, but we still have people below the poverty line. But they're far better off than they ever were. But relatively, and that's the key thing, they are still poor compared to other people. And so inequality is always a relative thing. And again, it becomes a political judgment whether you think it is fair that the 1% within the 1% of the population has a far greater than 1% proportion of the wealth. Do you want to be that 1% and be incredibly wealthy? Or do you want things to be more evened out? And again, these become political judgments, and geographers can really help through regeneration projects, through advising on these things, through critiquing them, through studying them and seeking to understand them, how best to maximise the potential of each of these interventions. So on economic, social and environmental criteria, inequality is not exacerbated and hopefully minimised. Because, to directly engage with the second question, yes, of course, people do actually benefit from inequality. Particular communities within society, particular cultures, particular stakeholders all benefit from economic investment in an area. They might make a profit from it, but local people might not benefit from it. That's the nature of the society and culture in which we live. So yes, we need to consider how we want to transform that and how we as individuals want to engage with that. Do geographers work on regeneration plans? All the time, in a whole manner of different ways. Within my own institution, we have people working on the Cardiff Metro, for example, on the transport system in and around Cardiff to change it. These are regeneration initiatives to increase accessibility, to engage with that inequality in relation to the physical mobility around the city and around its surrounding areas. We study a range of regeneration and rebranding initiatives, be that in terms of the built form or place marketing, and a whole range of jobs that are generated come from this, from consultancy to investment to, real estate work, to designing. In my own school, for example, we have a huge urban design sub-discipline which plans regeneration initiatives. What a city's going to look like, what a city's going to be like. We need the design skills on computers, but we need that kind of cultural imagination, that creativity to think, what are buildings, what are streetscapes, what are plazas going to look like? How's the sewage system going to work? How's the waste system going to work? When you think about the world and its jobs, geographers engage with these issues all the time. What an exciting discipline to be part of.